بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Peace and blessings be upon all of our respected viewers around the world. Welcome once again to Ahlul Bayt TV. This is the debate show, a lively discussion today. I hope we have two guests with us who are going to be discussing a fundamental topic, a fundamental question: does God exist? And to that end, and to discuss this particular question, we have with us today Bob Churchill, who is from the International Humanist and Ethical Union. And we also have with us Yaqub, who is from the Muslim Debate Initiative. I'm going to start by asking a very obvious question. As I mentioned, the title of our discussion is Does God Exist? Let's start with Jawad, if I may, as somebody who I assume believes that God does exist.
Yes, I completely believe that God exists. And I would like very much to talk about the real proof of the belief of God, rather than, for example, a lot of the moral issues or a lot of the relativistic issues that people get drawn into. I want to keep this discussion focused on things that we can genuinely prove and genuinely show. So scientific evidence, genuine proof. And for me, that's a very, very core thing. I think if you look at physics very closely, and if you also look at the consequences of physics, you will find that it is very, very hard to get around the fact that God is real and God does exist. I know this is an idea which isn't necessarily shared by everyone, but the more you study physics, the more you realize that the further down you go, within atoms, within subatomic particles, you start to have very strange quantum effects. One of these effects is known as wave-particle duality. For example, if you take an electron and you fire it at two slits, rather than passing through an individual one of those slits, it actually appears to create what is known as an interference pattern behind that. Now, that doesn't seem like a very important fact, but the thinking and what we know already about the world shows that it happens in what's called a probability distribution. And that probability distribution is governed by an iron equation of physics known as the Schrödinger equation. And that Schrödinger equation governs whether or not one particular outcome or another is more likely in one place or somewhere else. This may seem very abstract, but the central point of it is that it governs which reality we happen to be living in. In other words, it tells us what will happen next, given the sequence of what happened before and how likely that is to be. And that, hopefully, we'll unpack a little bit later on and be able to talk about how it's necessary for someone to observe that waveform, that probability curve, to collapse in order for us to have the reality that we exist in. And if that observer is indeed present, it has to be present everywhere across the whole universe, and that would be God.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bob Churchill.
I'd like to start by sort of discussing the question as a question. So before getting to an answer, just sort of try and frame and understand what we're talking about. I think one thing that's very interesting about it is that we're asking it at all. This isn't something that's always been historically possible, certainly not to the level that it is now. And I think today when we see a widespread public discussion of this, we should take note of that historical abnormality. Yeah, certainly it's always been the case, I think, that whilst there's been belief in gods, there are going to have been some minority of people like myself who don't believe in the gods or a god. Mm-hmm. Go back to Socrates. He's put to death for in part for his impiety and for putting down, for dissing the gods of the state. Today, we don't have that sort of, certainly in some parts of the world, in some places, that we can be talking about this question openly. And I think it's worth recognizing that not everyone has had that freedom. And also to say that we should welcome that freedom. I think the presumption that everyone believes has sort of waned somewhat. I think we're actually getting to the point now in the UK, for example, where if you had a big discussion, philosophical discussion, if your first question was, what is your religion? Some people would be a bit, well, you're being presumptuous. Like, why don't you ask, what is your worldview, or do you have a religion? So we're seeing this slow secularization in parts of the world that have opened up this space, and we should welcome that, because it's often atheists and agnostics and religious nonconformists in general, not just non-believers, but people who come from a minority wing of whatever faith and say, you know what, this religious practice is wrong, this religious belief is confused, this religious institution is corrupt. So we should welcome the people that question and are prepared, in principle, to give an answer no to even the biggest questions of religion. So I'm glad that we're able to ask it and to discuss this question at all. And maybe one other thing to say at this point is just to be pleased and recognise that it is a debate. So from my perspective, to sort of be able to say it's not obvious that there is a God to such an extent that the atheists can somehow be bracketed as heretics, or they can't possibly be suggesting there isn't a God unless they want to bring down the state or society and so on. We're recognising it as a valid question, perhaps for the first time in history on the scale that we now have, and I think that's something to be welcomed.
Okay, so again, if I can come back to you again, Bob, just so that we understand your stance, because there are a lot of technical terms. Some people are called agnostics, others are called atheists, and you get hardline atheists and those who. Can you tell me in your own words what you would define yourself as, or what terminology you would use to describe your state of mind, if you like, or ideology, and how you came to that?
My state of mind might be different from my beliefs, but yes. On the question of God, I think we have these words like atheist and agnostic, but for me those are very much about that question. They're about God. So I'm an atheist. You get people who are agnostics, and that means that that can mean a few different things. It might mean that they think, well, maybe there is a God, maybe there isn't, I'm not entirely sure. Right through to, on the other extreme, you get people who are agnostics in a sense of sort of saying, I think this question is sort of meaningless, so I don't want to give a yes or no answer because it's nonsense in some sense. So you get a real strand of difference in agnostics. But atheism and agnosticism are about that one question. So they're not necessarily a sort of replacement for religion. That's why I used the word worldview earlier, or life stance, for example, philosophy of life, if you like. Obviously, atheism isn't someone's entire approach to life. For lots of people, their broader approach to society and morality will be something unarticulated. Maybe they won't have it. For many people, we know that they will say, I'm spiritual but not religious. So they've rejected many of the traditional ideas of religion, including monotheistic God, but they have some spiritual or mystical beliefs as well. I'm a humanist, so I would say that I have a naturalistic view of the world. I don't believe in supernature or the divine, but I do believe that we are the moral actors in the world, that morality is about human interaction and working out what the best thing to do to keep society on track is, what is the right and principled way to be together, and that we don't need to refer outside of the human sphere in order to understand that. So that's broadly where I am.
Could I just come back on a little bit of that? I mean, I just have one question really. Why do you not believe that God exists? Or why do you believe that God doesn't exist? Either one of those.
Oh, I've heard all the traditional arguments for the existence of God. Philosophy was my academic training, and I think there's been a general sort of recognition. I think it's fair to say this. I can say this without compunction. I'm sure others would disagree with me.
Of course.
But certainly in sort of Anglo-American philosophy, the analytic philosophy of the sort of 20th century, these arguments, the traditional arguments for the existence of God, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the teleological argument, they have highfalutin terms, and they've fallen very much into disfavour. There are very few philosophers in academic circles around the world who would stand up and just say, well, obviously we know there's a God because of the ontological argument. There are so many arguments against these very ancient, very old arguments going back to Aquinas. These are very.
But those are not actually that old, and they're actually not that widespread either. I mean, you left out India, China,
yes,
Africa,
yeah.
Latin America. You have lots of different parts of the world which had their own religious traditions and had their own beliefs in gods or the divine. and they're
Well, I don't disagree
representations
that
of
that's-
it.
yes,
Well, I
they
mean,
do.
great. I mean, I'm glad that we agree on that point. But
There are lots of
but
religious
if,
people.
but if you're going to discount the belief in a universal creator or, you know, a divine being, and you're going to base it on just a small subset of the available human, you know, logic and thinking behind it, I mean, isn't that going to leave you with a certain amount of uncertainty as to whether or not you can truly rule it out? I mean, is that the real reason, you know, that you've got just because those arguments weren't strong enough to convince you, or is there perhaps anything else that supports your belief that
For me,
God
it was,
doesn't
but
exist?
I obviously, I'm not necessarily representative of every atheist in the world, but so I know certainly there are some people who came to a non-religious view because they were involved in a religion or a church or a practice, and they just went, you know what, the practice of this is wrong in some way. I'm seeing it oppress people, or not necessarily in the sense of, you know, full-on social oppression, but maybe in the sense of the church being too controlling over their lives, for example, or they've seen abuses carried out.
Again,
That's a fair number of people that are atheists today in the UK, for example, will have come from a background when they were raised as religious, and now they say things like, it wanted to control everything, it made me feel guilty, it made me do this. For me, it was more theoretical than practical. I was always interested in sort of big philosophical questions, but those questions prompted me to ask my parents to take me to church. So I was open to that idea in principle. You know, I'd been told through school, I went to a Church of England school, so I was told that that was the answer. But when I went to church and when we started doing our and we had a fairly religious education, and the religious education was fairly broad-minded and open to sort of critical arguments and so on. And then I went on to study philosophy. And yeah, so it is very much, partly it's rejecting those traditional arguments, which as much academic philosophy finds them lacking. And it's also that there are parallel arguments, much less discussed often, but which are atheological arguments, if you like, that are arguments against the existence of God. And they tend to get brought up less often, I think, because they wouldn't need to be made if the presumption of God wasn't there in the first place, right? So...
Okay, so what would make you, you know, believe that God is a presumption rather than a fact? I mean, were you somebody who was always, you know, in doubt of the belief of God? And, you know, if you had actually changed your mind on a theoretical basis, I mean, how did you arrive at that conclusion? And also, I mean, sorry, this is the second point, but it bears quite closely to the first one. Does that have any relevance as to whether or not God is actually, you know, real or not? Whether or not, you know, the church treats a group of people badly or well has no bearing on whether or not, you know, a divine being exists or not, does it?
No, I was answering the question, what makes people change their minds, and I think that is one element of it. And I don't think that that's irrational either. I think that, you know, if for example your picture of religion is that there is a supremely divine being that effectively heads this religion, and if your view of that is that that should filter down through every level of your church or your faith or whatever, and if in practice you see that the people trying to speak in the name of God are not living up to that in some way, I don't think there's nothing illogical or invalid about saying, well, hang on a minute, this calls into question the guy at the top. I think in the same way that if you were treated badly by a corporation, you might blame the culture of the corporation as opposed to just, and its general principles, as opposed to just an individual that you dealt with. It's not necessarily wrong to reject a religion on the basis of what happens in the name of the religion. I
mean, you're absolutely right. That would apply to a corporation or an organization with a particular remit, but it doesn't necessarily apply to, for example, a faith, which is, you know, a set of values that people believe about reality and about how they should govern their own lives, regardless of whether or not they get, you know, physical or other benefit out of it. I mean, also, these things are wonderful cultural questions, they're wonderful social questions, but again, they don't explain one way or the other whether or not one should believe in God or not. Because, I mean, the doubt that you're talking about is doubt that originates in the organization, is it not?
I'm saying there's theoretical reasons for
let's hear one.
As
right,
well.
Yeah, you mentioned there are some atheological arguments that are sometimes put forward that are sometimes not that often discussed. Can you mention a couple of those so that we can maybe mull over them a little?
I mean, the biggest, most obvious one that probably is discussed probably more than the arguments for, is the problem of suffering, the problem of evil, the idea that, well, if there's a supremely powerful God that is supremely good and can do anything, we seem to live in a very strange world for that. The urethra dilemma that Plato came up with, putting words into Socrates' mouth, going back and again reinvented around the world a number of times, is a sort of dilemma that says, what is good? Do the gods think that things are good because they are good? Do the gods love the good because the good is good? Or is the good good because God loves what is good? Does God or gods, are they controlled in effect by what is good? Do they have the power to act other than what is good, in which case they're not wholly good? Or do they, can they not act other than what is good, in which case they're perhaps not omnipotent, the things that they can't do? Now, it may sound trivial and it sounds complicated, but it's a classical dilemma. It says either that God is controlled by the concept of the good, which is independent of God, in which case we can say, well, then we don't need God. The good, what is moral, what is good, can be accessed directly. Okay. Or it's bound up with God, in which case it seems to arbitrarily depend on God's capricious.
Okay, so if you don't mind, I want Brother Jawad us to mull over these two particular issues in turn. First and foremost, I'm sure you've come across this many times before, the issue of suffering. Yeah. If there is a God, why are people dying of starvation in parts of the world? Why is there so much evil? Why are people able to kill women and children willy-nilly and no seeming intervention? Why are so many Muslims dying in Burma, for example, or what's happening in Syria, etc., etc.?
The only answer to that can be that people have free will and that they are responsible for the choices that they make. The world as it is given to us, and the circumstances in which we find ourselves, always present us with challenges. Sometimes these seem fair to us, sometimes they seem incredibly unfair to us. Sometimes we're not ready for them and they simply sweep us up in their wake. The tsunami is a very good example, which happened a few years ago. People will look at that and say, why did God do that? And the fact of the matter is that everyone is born, everyone lives, and everyone dies, and everyone experiences suffering, as well as moments of joy throughout that life. And whether or not an individual human being feels one way or another towards their circumstances doesn't really have a bearing on whether or not the universe was created by a divine being or is run by a divine being. Ultimately,
it certainly doesn't make it look feasible, though, right? I mean, it's the fact that there is this mixture of pain and pleasure and suffering, it certainly doesn't advance the cause of being a just
No. I would
God.
disagree with that. I would say that that is based on the invisible assumption and the highly, highly uncertain and untenable assumption that God is accountable to us. Because we are judging that what is presented to us is good for us or bad for us, or will make our lives worse or will make us better, and we do not have the right to judge simply because, and this is patently obvious to me because I know just how stupid I am, that I don't have all the facts, that I don't have all of the skills, that I don't have an infinite memory and an infinite will. I don't have all of these things. So yes, I will respond out of pain. Yes, I will respond out of suffering. Yes, I will respond with joy and with love to the people around me that I can do. But I won't do all of the things that I perhaps knew I could do, or I will not take up all of the opportunities, and there will be times where I will make mistakes, and that will unfortunately cause suffering to other people. I'm responsible for that, and all I can do is try and do good things after the fact, or try and prevent those things from happening. But that is a challenge that every individual faces. And the thing about it is that if God created a universe where we did not get to see the consequences of our free choices, we would not feel any moral reality. We would not feel any responsibility for the world or for ourselves. And as a consequence, there would be no inner self which would be better or worse in the future for our choices.
Can I put it to you that a simpler answer to this dilemma is to simply say, okay, well, if the universe looks and feels pretty much, if you're saying that, our investigation, our judgment of something like the tsunami, well, we're not infinitely wise, we don't really know all the full purposes and so on. In other words, we can't say it's right or wrong, it just seems to be a fairly random act. The universe is full of pain and suffering and so on. So isn't the simpler answer just to say, there is no God?
No, because that's lazy thinking and a shortcut.
Not lazy.
It's incredibly lazy. You're saying it's the simplest answer.
It's a parsimonious answer, yeah.
Well, parsimonious is just, you're playing semantics at the moment. Because
I like simple answers.
But
an over-convoluted answer is, for example, so if, for
but
example,
a simple answer is only an answer if it's correct. Does that account for the experiences that people had at the time? The fact that we were able to predict the tsunami very, very, very shortly before it happened meant that the emergency services had a chance to respond. The fact that those emergency services were there is an indication that we had had similar disasters in the past and we had started to take responsibility as a society for those. And how we reacted afterwards is a mark of how civilized we are as a people.
We don't disagree on that.
Well, you see, there we go. So we have a lot of common ground, but all of this common ground has very little to do with whether or not there's a divine being at the end of the day. The problem of evil is a gigantic red herring. That is my point.
If I could just jump in here. I mean, with regards to this concept of suffering, are we in agreement, be it, somebody who adheres to a faith and somebody who doesn't, are we in agreement that there is this idea or understanding, belief that there is no gain without pain? In other words, I want to become a Premier League football player. And if I'm sitting at home and not prepared to train and not prepared to control my diet, etc., etc., I will never become that which I hoped to be, that my ambitions helped me to be. Are we both in agreement that there is a order in the world whereby there is some sort of character building through what seems to be suffering?
I think definitely the way you approach your goals will determine whether or not you attain them, as much as whether or not circumstances are leaning in your favor or against. I think very much that who you are and who you choose to be as you enter the future makes a huge difference to what the outcomes will be. And I think, we wouldn't be too far apart on that, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, I don't disagree in general. If you put work in, that's more likely to produce positive responses. But of course, it's an imperfect equation. There are people that will work very hard, and then some accident will deprive them of any benefit. And I think you certainly couldn't say to a toddler killed, or a family who has a toddler killed in a tsunami, that they didn't work hard enough. There was something they did wrong. Well, no, that's clearly doesn't speak to that at all. So yes, there is pain and suffering. Yes, the world happens to be so constructed that obviously, I mean, it's a sort of, you were talking about science before and quantum mechanics. Well, physics tells us that you need to, in order for things to change, there has to be some energy input. So yes, if you sit on the couch all day, your soccer dreams are probably not going to come to anything. But equally, there is an apparent indifference in the universe as to how that works out. Let me explain what I mean by that, because it's another atheological argument for the non-existence of God. Would be to say, if we can look at the things that we do, the pain and the suffering that we experience, and so on, and there's no measurable impact above what we can explain by just looking at the world and understanding it, then it appears that the universe is indifferent in the sense of being sort of metaphysically naturalistic. So for example, if I put in loads of work and you put in loads of work and we're both trying to work for the same goal, and someone films us, they can clearly see that we're both doing the right stuff, and more than that we're both mentally sort of positive about it, and we go to achieve the goal, whatever it is, climbing the mountain or something. If I get sick the week before with a tummy bug or something, have I been punished? Or, well, no, probably not, right? It's just that's randomly what's happened. I've got a bug from somewhere, I've got a virus. We can explain the difference in our attainment in those purely physical terms. We can just look and say, yeah, we both were on course, but like that happened to this guy and it didn't happen to the other guy. There's no issue of judgment. left to apportion out to the universe. In other words, God doesn't seem to be, helping people who help themselves. It's just that the universe is such that you need to expend energy to achieve things. So there's no role for God in that process.
We're due for a break, but Brother Gerard, if you want to just come back on that particular point before we go to break.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking in terms of benefits and rewards and effort put in versus the risks that are faced by the individual, you're talking about game theory and economics, which is actually predicated upon some very strict mathematical foundations. Those things determine whether or not somebody, if they're subject to particular conditions or not, will exist in a particular way. And those have very discrete outcomes, they have very clear, strategies, etc. That's fine. But that, again, has nothing to do with wider reality. That only works in a very small subset of reality that you're able to control and portion off. The universe is vastly unexplored. The laws of the universe are mostly unknown to us. We're very, very fortunate that we've had the glimpses and the advances that we have had up until now. But no one would argue that we understand, a lot of the key things about the universe, and hopefully that, someday we will. And those things that will genuinely determine our future and that will give us insight into how our lives will unfold still remain to be seen. And I don't think that the argument that you put forward there really allows you to say that one person or another has gotten benefit or not, or the universe is indifferent or not, simply because in the grand sweep of things, as I said, we don't understand the full consequences of what we do now, but we do the best with what we can.
Okay, brilliant. Let's keep it there. Inshallah, as I mentioned, we're due for a break. When we come back, we can continue this discussion. Does God exist? See you soon. Tonight we're discussing a very pertinent question. Does God exist? My guests are Bob Churchill from the International Humanist and Ethical Union, and my second guest is Jawad Yaqub, who is from the Muslim Debate Initiative. Just to continue from where we left off, this question about suffering and two people with the same amount of sincerity, if you like, expending the same amount of energy won't necessarily get the same results. You also mentioned, a toddler who's not harmed anybody maybe being killed. One of the arguments I'm going to put on the table for you to maybe thrash over for a couple of minutes, or one of the Islamic arguments is, this is one of the proofs of God, if you like, because in life, people don't always get the justice they deserve. And so therefore there is, of course, the day of judgment where all of the wrongs that have been committed, all of those things that individuals or groups have got away with and taken to their grave, for example, they will be answerable for. I want you to both maybe thrash this argument out for a couple of minutes, please.
I think it's harder from my perspective, I suppose, to come to grips with that, except, again, to say the simpler answer to that conundrum is that there is no God. And that if we accept that as an answer that actually does the same job of solving the problem, if we accept that there is injustice in the world, if we accept that we can put equal efforts in and get different results because there is no God pulling the strings on a day-to-day basis that we can tell, you effectively conceded that just before the close there, that even when you try and hive things off and say it's game theory and so on, we do seem to be at least agreeing that there's no measurable, identifiable benefit to someone doing something in the name of God or in tandem with that.
I didn't say that.
Okay.
I was talking about the fact that the way in which you framed your response was based on the idea that you had a subset of the world that you looked at, and you were comparing two different people that were working very, very hard towards a particular goal. In this case, climbing Mount Everest. One of them fell sick just before climbing it. One of them actually got to the top. But that's a game where you're comparing one set of circumstances with another set of circumstances and deciding that everything, about that particular life or that particular scenario is aimed towards one benefit or one goal. Real life isn't like that. We choose and we change our goals. We go in many different directions. We go forward, we go backwards all the time, and we change and we grow, and sometimes we think that we were wrong. And as a consequence, a lot of those things, a lot of the framework of thinking that you were using that would have applied very, very well in that particular limited circumstance doesn't apply, even in normal everyday human life, and it certainly doesn't apply in the wider reality that we don't know.
Are you implying the opposite then, that you think that if someone does something in some way in the name of religion or something, or that they are doing something in piety, that is likely to make it easier for them, that it's better?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to go completely out on a limb here and say that if a person does good, if a person tries their best, if a person is sincere, that they, put the real action in, whereas other people will shirk or, deny or do all of those things, that they will make a moral difference in the world, they will make a physical difference in the world, that they will stand in the way of people getting hurt.
But aren't you just talking there about self-belief and consistent and coherent behaviour? Well then, if that's the case, where do you draw the line? So does this only apply to the correct religion or religions? Does this only apply if your belief maps to the correct conception of God, or is it all the religious people and none of the atheists?
Well, I can't speak for everybody else, but I can certainly speak as a Muslim and say that I know that God judges everyone based on their own life and their own circumstances. He doesn't obviously judge a Muslim in a way that would be applicable or analogical to, say, some alien living in a far-off galaxy far, far away, because the lives simply don't overlap. They don't perhaps face even the same circumstances or the same challenges. But here on Earth, we have lots of different people who try and discover what the good is, who try and do good with each other. We have so much in common that it is actually pretty obvious to us what certain things are which are good and what certain things are which are not. I mean, we have a shared biology. All of us have a shared history, we have cultures, we have society, we have stories, we have science, which tells us how to differentiate between things which are testable, provable and true, and those things which are exploratory and those things which are not, which we've discovered to be false.
I don't disagree with pretty much anything you've just said at all.
Wonderful.
But there is no evidence being offered that God is having any hand in these human affairs. So I completely agree with you.
That's fine.
We are a heterodox bunch of people randomly competing, pursuing aims, doing all sorts of things in the world at large, working together in collaboration against each other sometimes. There's no obvious evidence that God has any role in that. We are all
right.
our views do, our self-belief does.
Sure.
And that might be faith. It might just be self-belief. It might be ambition. All those things have a role to play. But I don't see that any external force has any role to play.
And of course that's a whole debate in itself. How does God intervene in our lives or not? Does he take a back seat and is watching everything? Or, is there some element of free will and some predestination? That's a debate for another day. The question I want to ask is, if you are of the opinion that there is no intervention from a higher being, how then do we move on to the conclusion that there is no God, from the fact that you're not seeing any, or there seems to be no apparent intervention from a higher being?
Well, obviously that's not the only reason, as it were. It's not the only contributing factor to someone saying, therefore I don't believe in it. But I think it is. So, sometimes people say lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. They say that just because there's no evidence for something doesn't mean it's not there, which can be true, right? Like there are things that certainly there are things that happen, we have no evidence for them, but they are still happening. But equally, if it's a really big claim, like if I said I have a dragon in my flat, then a lack of evidence, like the fact that there's not smoke coming out the windows and the walls haven't been knocked down, that is pretty good evidence that I'm lying, that there is no dragon in my flat. So lack of evidence can be evidence that there is nothing there. And I think when we look at the world and see society,
how does that apply to religion?
We cannot agree upon any divine intervention at all. So a Muslim might say, well, like historically it's recorded there were these miracles. A Catholic might say, well, historically it's recorded and ongoing there are miracles occurring. But no one agrees on them, because it's only from those religious traditions that they seem to be at all convincing or cogent. And as soon as you're outside of that, it becomes very easy for us to sort of say, well, no, I don't think that the success of that person from that religion was based on God because they don't believe in the correct God, or I don't believe that was a miracle. And we all become skeptics, and we all become atheists about other religions' gods, and we become skeptics about other religions' miracles much of the time. It's unlikely that a person from one religion will attest and say, yes, all the miracles of that other religion are fine. And immediately there's a skepticism there, which enables people to sort of say, oh yes, I don't believe that there was all those witnesses. I don't believe that that actually happened. It couldn't happen if Noah's Ark actually did this, or if that river turned to whatever. So we are all skeptics and atheists about most religions in the world most of the time.
But then the natural question is that, all right, so one person asserts that something is the case, the other person asserts that it's not the case, that you don't believe it. You still haven't answered the question of why you have come to the conclusion that you don't believe it, or have you chosen that you won't believe it without considering all of the evidence? For example, I mean, the reasons that I talked about at the very start, about things being genuinely provable and not provable, a lot of this stuff that we have discussed, a lot of the stuff that is coming, please forgive me for saying so, but from this side of the table over here, it's cultural. It's to do with people's feelings about life. It's to do with, well, I'm not comfortable with what he says, so I'm not going to follow it. Or I feel that he's pushing too much, this pyramid type structure is putting too much pressure upon me, so we're going to reject what they happen to believe as well. What we're talking about is actually whether or not God exists. Does God exist? Do you believe he exists?
No.
No. Okay. Did you ever believe that he did exist?
As a child, in a nominal sort of way.
Okay. And what was the defining moment that made you move across? Or was it a series of different things? And when you found yourself on the other side, how did you manage to make, for example, those questions that you explored through philosophy start to make sense to you again in a new framework? I mean, those are huge questions, but they have nothing to do with whether or not God exists.
Well, no, I think that they do, and I think because it's one of the things that contributes. And it's not the case that it's just cultural or social to say that so you asked, was there a defining moment? For me, no. For lots of people, there is a defining moment. For me, it was a mass of arguments against the idea of God, arguments against arguments for God, so counter-arguments to the arguments for God, that left me going, well, there is no evidence. That's one of the things that I didn't mention at the start of this debate when I said, let's discuss the question itself, does God exist?
Yes.
It assumes that this is a natural sort of question that must occur. We use a capital G for the God. So we have a really specific cultural notion of God in mind, in a sense. So the monotheistic God, when we ask, does God exist? We didn't ask, do any supreme beings exist? Do God or gods exist? And it's not clear to me why that we treat that question as if the people that detract from it are the ones that have to do the explaining.
I mean, I can give you an answer to that straight away.
There is no evidence for something, then that is a reason to say, well, I don't need to believe in that.
Okay, so let's try and address that particular point. You said you had an answer for it.
That's because, as I pointed out earlier on, the vast majority of people in this world and throughout the whole of human history have believed in religion. From independent sources, they have come to the belief that there is a spiritual dimension to the world, that religion matters, that what you do has a moral dimension, that actually there's much more to the world, and the divine beings exist, or one divine being exists, and that these divine beings, or this one divine being, has an impact on life. Now, as time has gone on, we've found a trend towards monotheism. Islam is notable, that it actually pares away a lot of the cultural and social associations that would normally have dragged people back towards anthropomorphizing the divine, which actually goes back to what you were saying about the gods, do they know what is good or not? That assumes that if you are a divine being, if you are a creator of a universe, and if you are the creator of a universe, you're going to be fundamentally different from you and I. Because while you and I might be creative, I haven't really created any universes today that I know of. And the fact of the matter is that if you are that fundamentally different, then anthropomorphizing, putting a human face on something that cannot be limited in the human way is absurd.
So on this particular point about the nature of good or the nature of good and evil, if an action has been legislated by God, thou shalt not kill.
Yeah.
Okay, thou shalt not kill. Is that because killing in of itself is inherently bad, or is that just because God decided to make killing bad? I think this is, I'm trying to break it down into very simple terms, the argument that you were putting forward.
Sure.
And your argument was that if God has legislated that killing is bad because killing is inherently an evil act, that therefore compromises his omnipotence. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah?
That would be the argument.
Okay, that would be the
So
argument. Okay, so
yes.
again, I'm just trying to break it down to very simple language.
If
So,
God is effectively constrained by the nature of good,
Right.
then there are things that he's constrained against, can't do.
Okay.
That's the,
So-
that's the argument that is made.
so how do we, as Muslims, address this question when it's put to us?
It's very simple. We talk about the constraints from a human perspective because we do not understand the nature of God. As I said just a moment ago, anything or any being that can create a reality, a sum total of a reality, is going to be fundamentally different. So our notions of good, our understanding of what is good for us and what is good for the world comes from our experience. And there's nobody around this table, in fact, I don't think there's anybody in the world who would say that our experiences are wide enough or deep enough or rich enough to allow us to conceive the ultimate nature of the divine in that way, or indeed the universe in that way, or the driving forces of the universe in that way.
Can I put it to you then that when you're caught on the horn of a dilemma like urethra or any other argument against suffering and so on, you go to this point where you say, well, that's to do with God's obscurity, in effect, that we can't understand it. We can't map our human circumstances and feelings and experiences onto this thing because it's outside the scope of that. And yet you do claim to know many things about God if you believe in particular religious texts. The very idea of claiming that you believe in its existence implies that you know enough about it and that it's not obscure enough that you're able to say, I've made an intellectual decision that I do believe in. So it's not clear to me how, if from my point of view, I think the world is basically indifferent to us. Doesn't mean that efforts don't result in rewards sometimes, but and that there is a logic to human affairs because we make that logic, we make the morality between us. But it does mean that I have no reason to believe in this God, and then I'm told that this God is just utterly beyond comprehension anyway. So it seems like it's put in a box where it's like you can only touch it if you want to assert its existence. And as soon as you want to say anything else about it, including that, well, I don't need to believe in it then, we're told, oh, well, you have to believe in it because of whatever. And so it feels like you're using its profound obscurity as a cloak to cover it and hide it from criticism.
Brother
from
Jawad,
paradox.
is God beyond our comprehension?
I think the ultimate nature of God would have to be beyond our comprehension. However,
Not its existence.
exactly. And now I'll separate that out for you because obviously, this goes back to what I was talking about before, okay? We talked about how you have what's known as a probability wave that goes off into the future. I'm not going to get too abstract about it, but effectively, you have two ways of looking at the physical world as we talk about it now. You have a probability wave governed by something called Schrodinger's equation, and you have to have one outcome which equates to the universe that you observe. So you can either have the goal going in the back of the net or the goal missing the net. I mean, that's obvious, I think. But you only live in a universe when you're watching a football match. When one of those two things happens, you don't see both of them. Now, if you think of an electron and it does pretty much exactly the same thing when it goes through, say, those two slits, you don't get the expected pattern of just two lines after they're fired through those two holes when they hit the wall at the back. You get this beautiful interference pattern, which suggests there's a lot more going on there. Now, scientists have gone through a whole deep process, but eventually they've come to the idea that one of two things happens. Either this waveform, this probability equation wave, collapses to one of those outcomes, which is the one that we see, and this happens at the point of observation. Or you have a totally different scenario, which if we need to, we'll touch on later. But if we touch on the first one, if that probability wave does collapse and it collapses to create the world that we're talking about, then that has to be observed. And this is something known as a Copenhagen interpretation in physics. It's hard, solid science. It's not something that I'm making up. It's not something that is cultural. It's not something that's social. It's tested. We understand that quantum physics does work, that this actually is the basis, for example, as to why a light bulb flickers in the particular way that it does, or, for example, our computer systems work the way that they do. Because if we didn't understand this, it wouldn't be possible to build those systems in that way. The upshot of this is that in this particular world, something has to be observed in order for the waveform to collapse. Now, obviously, there are a limited number of people in the world. There are a limited number of, let's assume, intelligent beings that we can be aware of, but we don't know. What counts as an observer and what doesn't? Einstein mocked the people in Copenhagen by saying that it could be something as simple as a sidelong glance from a mouse that allowed something to go one way or the other. But the only real way to get around the fact that the universe exists, whether or not we happen to observe it, for example, when we wake up after we sleep, or that it carries on, in that indifferent way that you're talking about, that exact indifferent way that you're talking about, is that it's observed and collapsed across the universe by one observer.
I think it's a very informatively, forgive me, it's a very informatively wrong reading of the double slit experiment, which indeed, as you say, if you fire an electron, if you fire a whole bunch of electrons through two slits, then they interfere with each other just like water would through two slits, and so you get a funny interference pattern on a wall behind, or whatever device you're using, sensor you're using to measure. So you expect lots of individual photons of light to interfere like that. That's fine. We can test that. That's not in debate at all. We can also see that when you fire one electron, one photon through the double slit experiment, the weird thing is, and again, this is standard science, as you said, this is a demonstrable, testable, reshowable thing. It interferes with nothing, with itself. So a single electron seems to behave as it, photon seems to behave as if it is interacting with all these others. Hence we say we seem to have wave-particle duality, that a single particle is behaving like a wave. Now you're right that observation plays an effect in collapsing the wave function. When we observe the two slits that an electron can pass through, and we make sure that we test and measure, and we turn on our sensor, in effect, and say, okay, which one did it actually go through? That collapses the wave function. That, in and of itself, reduces the wave so that now the sensor only picks up a single electron that hits the back wall. So it does seem that human observation, or measurement in some sense, will collapse the wave function and reduces it. But when no one is looking, when, as far as you're concerned, God is looking, but as far as I'm concerned, no one is looking, it behaves as if no one is looking. Nothing happens. The wave-particle duality does not collapse in and of itself. We have to make it collapse with some measurement. So I discovered a new atheological argument.
No. This is beautiful, because what you've said just now says that the universe doesn't exist unless you look at it.
No, I haven't.
Okay, so what was that you were saying? You said that if it
experiment, when you set up a single photon, that it's still there. Something is still happening. The photon still passes through the experiment. So unless we measure it, unless we disturb the experiment and do something, nothing happens. When you leave it to itself, there does not appear to be anyone watching.
Okay, I'm going to have to, we're actually due for a break, but I wanted us to maybe move away from this particular argument, because you're getting quite, if you don't mind me saying, quite technical. And I have to admit, you're even losing me, and not that science was one of my strong subjects at school anyway. But as I mentioned, it wasn't one of yours either. Okay, but you've obviously done a lot of research in this area. Well, we're due for a break. When we come back, I need to ask some other questions that can possibly, arguably help us determine whether we can prove or disprove the existence of God. Join us in a couple of minutes, inshallah. See you soon. Debate show. This is the third and final segment of the question that's been asked tonight and being discussed tonight. Does God exist? With my two guests, Bob Churchill from the International Humanist and Ethical Union, and Jawad Yaqub, who is from the Muslim Debate Initiative. I wanted to ask you both, Whenever the discussion about God and the existence of God arises, I'm not saying this is necessarily your particular stance, it may be one of your stances, but many atheists say that you Muslims, Jews, Christians, whoever you may be, cannot prove God. I can't see, I can't touch, I can't feel this God that you're talking about, therefore I do not believe in his existence. Is this really a valid discussion to be having? Are you talking about, trying to prove something which, by definition of those monotheistic religions, is not tangible in the first place? I'll start with you first, Bob.
I think that is something that people say in one way or another, and that is a valid approach. It's very rarely, I think, the whole story. So yeah, I think it's valid if people say, well, there's no evidence for a quite extraordinary claim. Like, well, now that we've sort of come out, for some of us, having come out of the culture of religion and so on, when we look at this claim, it looks like a pretty big claim, and you need pretty big evidence for pretty big claim, like the dragon in my flat. So I think it is valid to say, well, if you can't show me any evidence of such an extraordinary notion that bears no relation to my everyday life or apparent existence, then that's a reason against it. But there are these other atheological arguments that we've discussed. I think that so many of the sort of positive arguments that get advanced are so wispy they could apply to anything. So you're describing an example from quantum mechanics, which, as I said, and we will move away from it. But as I said, I don't think it shows what you think it does. But equally, people have used the double slit experiment to argue that we maybe live in a virtual universe because it appears that our observation changes the experiment almost as if it's a video screen and the world only needs to simulate that which we're seeing. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that sort of argument, but I would certainly not say, oh right, on that basis I now definitely believe that we live in a virtual universe. It's a wispy kind of argument. We have very little evidence, very little corresponding logic to get on grasp with, and that's how I feel about, and I think how many people respond to the logical arguments for the existence of God. They all feel like they never establish what they set out to establish in exactly the same way that I don't think the quantum mechanics experiment can establish we live in a virtual universe. It's just, it's so far away from achieving that goal.
Okay, I'll finish the quantum mechanics stuff now, but I would like to make clear that I did not suggest that the quantum mechanics means that we live in a virtual world. What I was saying was something entirely different.
Say that. I'm saying it's an analogously wispy argument.
Okay, but when you're talking about proofs for the existence of God in real people's lives, then you have to look at real people's lives and the impact of the belief of God and what it actually means for them, and also what they see in the outside world and how they ascribe meaning to the outside world and whether or not they discover meaning in the outside world. People discover meaning in a variety of different ways, and it's meaning that actually informs our narratives. And it's a subset of those narratives which form, for example, science, and also form the lives that we live and that we share. And it is perfectly natural for people to look for answers and to find proof and to find things that are profound in that. And from that, be able to develop an understanding, a mature understanding of how it is that the world works in terms of moral consequences, in terms of physical consequences, and also in terms of spirituality. Now, it is not for nothing that pretty much every culture in the world has some notion of the divine, and it is not for nothing that pretty much every culture in the world has tried to develop at least some form of science to try and understand this, and has developed morality so that we could actually get along better with each other. And God is seen in all of those things, as well as the physical and the technical and abstract discussion that we were talking about later on. We can take that up, I think, at another time. So let's focus on the fact that people will find reasons to believe in things that make sense to them, and also that make sense in the context of the life that they're living in. And for that, a good example of that is, say, somebody who gets dropped into London from, say, being a student in another part of the world. They arrive in a place, they have one set of values, and they suddenly realize that they have to adapt to how they live and what they do. And for the vast majority of their life, everyone else has been very similar to them, and suddenly they're in a place where everyone is very different to them. there are different ways to react to that. Either you can say, look, I'm going to reject everything else and just sort of, narrowly focus down, or just, be confrontational, or I could, start to adopt it. I could start to, embrace it. I could start to change. What does that mean for that person's internal map of the world, and what does that mean for their belief in God? A lot of Muslims face that particular challenge. A lot of non-Muslims face that particular challenge as well. And when we come to it, we have to start to separate our belief in God from, say, particular instances that we were taught, describe the presence of God in our life. And we have to understand that our belief in God comes from our genuine understanding and our engagement in the world as somebody who makes a difference, who's able to get this knowledge in and actually transform themselves into a being which is able to function at all the levels that humanity and civilization require us to. That sounds very abstract, but that's how people find God. That's how people genuinely find beauty and love and connection with other people. And they have to choose the path that they go through for that.
Mm-hmm. So if someone says, well, I have a set of humanist values, I have an understanding of the world that sort of says that we have to base morality in the likely consequences of our actions, as you mentioned yourself, in what is human nature, but also what we want human nature to be. Human nature isn't fixed. It seems to be sort of slowly changing in different aspects over time. There are things that we can say and do that mould ourselves and mould other people. And I feel that's very important. And to me, it's very important that it is all in this world. When I'm thinking about how my actions affect someone else, whether I'm relating to them as a unique person and what will happen next and what should apply specifically in their situation. I don't want to have to defer outside to God or refer to anything else. I think that I can do that by talking with them as a person, as a unique individual, and that's important to me. So I'm not necessarily saying that proves you wrong, but what I am saying is that if your argument is just on the basis of sort of self-affirmation, that this is how people find God around the world, as you were saying, well, other people find other things, so they find different religions or many gods, and all of us, well, not all of us, but many of us have worldviews of some kind or another, a philosophy, an approach, a way of approaching the world, and find some sort of succor or value in them. It doesn't prove that they're right. They're all different. They're very different, and yeah, lots of them are monotheistic, lots of them are atheistic, lots of them are polytheistic. I don't see that the fact that they are there and the fact that people find meaning in them doesn't prove that they're right. And just to finish on the other point that you mentioned was that many people, every culture has invented God's religion of some kind of spirituality.
I didn't say invented.
Okay, sorry.
I said, they came to an understanding of the world, and they came to an understanding of that as being a fundamental part of the world.
But again, that doesn't show us that spiritual realm is true or correct. So, for example, that every human in every culture has superstitions of various kinds that are often completely irrational. We can study them very well. The fact that we invent these superstitions doesn't mean that they are correct. The fact that we invent notions, like every culture has invented notions of sort of little people that live just outside of vision and scope, and they go by different names, but they're always there. And it doesn't mean that they're real just because there happens to be.
Okay, let me give you an example of just the kind of mental blind spot that people have when it comes to those kinds of superstitions and beliefs and myths about the real world. So, for example, I mean, if you and I were describing each other, let's say in front of a member of the KKK, right? They would say that you were white and I was black, right? Yeah. Okay. Yes. I mean, would you describe yourself as a white person if you were asked?
Usually, if it was clear that they meant the standard categories of ethnicity, even though very clearly skin is not white.
Exactly. There you go. But you see, but what I'm saying is that you're exceptional. You see, you've given it some thought. The vast majority of people I know, when they think of a white person, they go, okay, he's white. Okay, this person is black or brown, and someone who's green, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in Northern Ireland, and you had this notion, oh, I've never met a black fella before. I said, I'm not black. I don't know what color I am, but I'm certainly not black, And you're not white either. I've never met a white person my entire life. And that, shocked people. And I said, look, take your hand, put it on that sheet of paper. If your hand's gone invisible, then, you're either a ghost or you're dead or something else, but you're certainly not, you're not white. You can't claim to be white, and that upsets people because it's taken an identity, it's an assumption, and unless you actually spend time fighting around the outside edges of this and you come across all of these ideas, you're not really going to be able to even see that as something that people are aware of.
If I may, can I move the discussion on, because we are running out of time, and if you like, one of the strongest arguments or strongest sources of comfort for a Muslim when discussing the existence of God, you mentioned before miracles in the past, let's say the miracles of Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, which are recorded in the New Testament. We may be skeptical about those now because we would maybe question, were really that many people there when he turned water to wine, whatever it may have been. But one of the arguments, and I remember this because of a paper I wrote many years ago to do with Karl Popper, who was stating that when we're talking about trying to prove things scientifically, it's very difficult to prove humanities, if you like, sociological subjects and religions. Of course, you can't prove them or test them in a laboratory kind of setting. You can't mimic experiments and then test them out. So his theory was that you make claims. You make a claim, and it's for the skeptics and the doubters to come and disprove those claims. And I remember looking up in the Holy Book of Islam, which Muslims, you may or may not have heard before, considered to be a miracle in itself, because it's an intact, as they believe, as the Muslims state, an intact verbatim word of God. Now in this book it makes certain claims, such as if this book was from other than God, you would find many contradictions therein. Or there's another challenge where in it says if this book is not a divine book, then produce a book like it. And then elsewhere it says, well, not even a book like it, just 10 chapters like it. And then elsewhere it says, forget 10 chapters, just one chapter like this. And for me, I remember reading up on these claims, and one of the things that Karl Popper mentions as well is the more outrageous, outlandish the claim, the easier it is to falsify it. But at the same time, with the lack of falsification, the more stronger the argument is. So how would you then approach those types of arguments or claims or challenges put forward by the Quran, which Muslims claim to be the word of God?
Wow, that was quite a question. Karl Popper certainly, falsification is his big thing. He's sort of against the idea of proof. He doesn't think that you can prove anything. I mean, no,
he says really he's not against proof. He says you can prove things, but the problem is, the concept.
The idea of sort of verifying a theory through experiment is precisely what he starts by rejecting. So
he says you can verify it, but the problem is you cannot verify every single entity in the world.
He's the anti-verificationist philosopher
because of the fact that you can't.
You cannot. He goes so far as to say that you can't really have positive evidence. All evidence is evidence that you've tested the theory, and as you said, that you've maybe failed to falsify it, which is okay. That's good. Like if you have come up with a theory that impinges on the world in lots of ways, i.e., makes lots of predictions, then it is more falsifiable. So he likes that very much. I think merely being complicated or bold or making predictions is not the whole thing that makes things a scientific claim. I mean, that was his driving impetus to start with, was how do I divide what is science from what is not science. Certainly with something like a religious text, one response to the kind of challenge that you've laid down would be to say, well, I certainly can produce other books that other people say are similarly free of contradiction, similarly beautiful, that were produced in similar circumstances, that I can produce
such as
written testimony. The Bible. There are people that believe the Bible was written, is the divine word of God. I know that makes no historical sense, but it's not me making the claim. There are people that claim that that they read the Book of Mormon and they see something absolutely new. When it comes to miracles, there are Christians will attest to one miracle, and as far as I can see, in the very same terms that any member of any other religion might attest to a miracle. But they're all the different religions are skeptical of their other claims. So that looks to me like it's a field for opinion based on culture, as you put it
But
before.
Islam is unique in that
Every religion claims to be unique. Every single religion claims to be divinely unique and perfect.
But unique in what sense do you say can make that claim, Lord?
So I was going to say Islam is unique in that we are asked to prove to ourselves that God exists. We are asked to challenge the Quran in that way. We're asked to challenge our understanding of God in that way. We're asked to challenge our understanding of the world and all of the things that we hold dear. In fact, the Quran enjoins us time and time again. Look at the ruins of the people that have been left behind. Look at what they thought they would do. God has destroyed thousands of generations before us, and He will potentially, do the same for thousands after us. What matters is how we live now, not our particular fashion, not our culture, not any of those other things. What matters is how we live now, and that is fundamentally the axis of morality that we're talking about.
Okay, we unfortunately have come towards the end of the show, but I always like to give you both an opportunity. Unfortunately, it's only going to be about a minute and a half max to just, I guess, conclude your viewpoints in view, or with the benefit of hindsight, having spoken to each other. Who wants to go first?
I can start then. I think that it's a very interesting discussion. I do think that when we think about this whole question, does God exist, as a question, one of the first things that we could do, I realise it's the last thing we're doing, but one of the first things we should do is put it in context. Think about all the other problems that there are within religion, without religion. Think of the turbulent history and the current schisms and sectarian conflicts that we have, and actually think, when it comes to deciding is someone a good person or a bad person, are they contributing to society or not, and so on, the question, do they believe in God or not, is very small. And I think the worst thing that could happen is for our answer to that question, whether it's yes or no, to become yet another sort of metaphysical war banner, like all the other sort of religious and sectarian questions can become, that we need to focus on the humanity and the here and now, and that this question, interesting as it is philosophically, does not necessarily define a person to the core.
Gerard?
I think that our understanding of science is imperfect, but we know enough to know that science is based on things which are measurable. And one thing that science has taught us recently is that when we do measure something at that very basic level, we change it. And that observation of an event actually changes the nature of the event. The fact is that there are events going on in the universe now of which we are not aware, but which impact us, and which will impact us as we go forward. And for the whole universe to be observed, that requires a being that is able to encompass it in its mind, and that would be God. And that is a nutshell of the physical argument that I was talking about earlier. But I would also say that because our understanding of the world is imperfect, that we come back and time again find value in the Quran and in engagement with the world and in challenging our own assumptions as well to make ourselves better people. And that is one of the core ways in which we discover that God does exist, not just as an abstract or a physical entity, but as something real in our lives.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob Churchill and Jawad Yaqub. It was a very interesting discussion. If you would like to comment on this particular show today, then you can email us. The email address is ahlulbayt.tv, info@ahlulbayt.tv. And of course, if you have any suggestions for future shows, future topics that we could explore, then please do get in touch. Thank you very much for watching. And on behalf of all of our viewers, I'd like to thank you both for taking the time out to spend with us.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.